All right, so there are lots of different ways to evaluate an industry. What we're going to talk about today is an approach called Porter's 5 competitive forces, and then of course what it means to marketers. Now, this is a very traditional business school approach to evaluating industries using Porter's 5 competitive forces. This is from Michael Porter. He's a famous economist. And so you probably saw this maybe in your economics course. I'm sure you saw it in Marketing 301, maybe even in Management 301, and in probably 3 or 4 other marketing classes. Somebody probably mentioned Porter's 5 competitive forces, maybe even in your international marketing class. So let's talk a little bit about this. Um, one of my favorite sort of lines is it's easier to be successful in an expanding industry than one that has no growth. And of course, the reason for that is that industries that have no growth, the only way that you can increase your market share is to take it away from someone else, which is much more confrontational and typically much more expensive than simply growing with the market as it expands. So we're going to talk about Porter's 5 competitive forces, and these are all things that you've heard about before in other classes and probably discussed in other classes. The 5 forces are the intensity of rivalry among competitors, and that, of course, is driven by pressure from substitutes, the power of buyers, the power of suppliers, capacity utilization, and threats of entry. Now, capacity utilization is really covered in the intensity of rivalries so we'll talk about that as we go along. All right, so this is the typical model that is presented for this, where we have threats of new entrants, determinants of buyer power, threats of substitute products, and then determinants of supplier power, all impacting the rivalry among existing firms. Because Porter's view is that the more rivalry that we have among existing firms, the more friction there is in this type of an economy and the less profits there are. So let's start with threats of substitutes. Okay, now the idea behind the threats of substitutes is that a person doesn't necessarily have to buy a product from your industry if there are substitutes for them. The example that I like to use is the example of gasohol. I lived in Iowa back in the early 1980s, and that was a point in time when the state of Iowa and the federal government got very interested in something called gasohol, which was a mixture of gasoline and ethanol that was produced by using corn and bean byproducts, that is, corn stalks and corn cobs and things like that, rather than the actual corn. And as a result, they would make ethanol out of that, and then they would blend that ethanol with gasoline to create a very good gasoline that ran clean and ran well in cars. Most gas stations in Iowa then sold something called the E85. And of course, it wasn't for e-commerce. It wasn't electronic, or it wasn't digital. It was ethanol-based gasoline, and that's why it was called. And that's why we eventually got the notion of gasohol. Okay, and so and it was very interesting because in Iowa and even nationally, the federal government put a subsidy in so that ethanol and E85 was much cheaper to buy and use in your automobile than regular gasoline, even though it actually costs more to produce. So the idea behind threats to substitutes is that if people have options rather than just your product to purchase, then of course the amount of profitability in a particular industry tends to go down. And that, of course, is impacted by the buyer's propensity to substitute. Are they willing to substitute? Product substitution options. Are there lots of options available? Buyer switching costs, of course, and the buyer switching costs refer to how much it costs to change from one product, using one product to another. For instance, if you are heating your home with heating oil or propane gas, and you decide you want to switch to natural gas, how much does it cost to do that? Well, you might have to put a new furnace in. You might have to run some lines. Or, there could be lots of expenses associated with that. On the other hand, gasohol was simply you put gasoline in your gas tank rather than regular gasoline. You put gasohol in. And so there was really no switching cost, at least not in the short run. In the long run, it turned out that ethanol was hard on certain kinds of plastic parts in your automobile. And of course, you all know that automobiles have a number of plastic parts associated with them. The relative prices of the substitute. So if the substitute is dramatically cheaper, then people will tend to want to use that substitute. And we see a lot of examples of people using a substitute, even though it doesn't work as well, it's cheaper. And then there's the issue of the relative quality of the substitutes. Are the substitutes as high a quality, and do they get the same performance aspects? So these are all issues that affect the threat of substitutes. The more substitutes there are for your product, the more competition there is, and the fewer profits there are to be had by any individual firm. And then, of course, there's the bargaining power of buyers. So if you're a supplier of something and buyers have bargaining power, then they can force you to reduce your costs and renegotiate with them, and they have all of the power. Now, part of the benefit of the internet is that it has, one of the reasons that buyers have lots of power on the internet is because they have access to lots of information. And so as a result, they have closer to what economists like to refer to as perfect knowledge, or a wide range of knowledge about the options available for them as buyers. So as the power shifts to the buyers from you, the supplier, your chances of making lots of profits go down. What are factors that affect the buying power of buyers? Well, the buyer's price sensitivity, the buyer's willingness to trade off and substitute, the product similarity. That is, if buyers see the products as all similar, then you as a supplier probably can't get a premium price for your particular product. The next, of course, is customer volume. The more customers there are, the less power they have, obviously. And so, if there is more demand than there is supply, then the buyers don't have as much power. Many years ago, when I worked at a company called Westclocks, the world's largest producer of timepieces, I was their plastics engineer. And it was kind of a big deal job because I was the only plastics engineer that we had in a company that was making 20 million alarm clocks a year, of which almost all of them had plastic parts. And so it was, but it was also during the time of the oil crisis in the mid 1970s. And as a result, most of you probably know that plastic is made from petroleum. So as the price of gasoline went up and and petroleum went up, and as petroleum became more scarce, the price of plastic went up. And the problem, of course, was that there were lots of companies that were looking for plastic, and there weren't very many places producing it. Now, we were a little bit lucky because we were right next to a Foster Grant factory that was making plastics to use in injection molds like we were using. So we had a supplier right next to us, but our bargaining power kept getting reduced and reduced and reduced, and we kept getting we didn't get the great prices that we'd had originally. And the reason that happened was simply because there were lots of customers that Foster Grant could sell that plastic to. And then, of course, there's the issue of information asymmetry, and that is, if the buyers don't know as much as the suppliers, then they don't have as much power. But once the consumer, the buyer of the product, whether it's a business to business buyer or an end individual consumer, is that once they have all the information, and they can use that information to gain power in the negotiations. But if they don't have that sort of power, then of course they don't have as much bargaining power. Then we have bargaining power of suppliers. So if I'm a producer of something, I have to buy products, raw materials, or inputs from suppliers. Well, so does the supplier have power over me as a company? Well, the way that we look at the bargaining power of suppliers is it really depends on the presence of substitute inputs. So my supplier has power over me if I don't have any other options. If the only option is them, then they've got more power in that relationship. There's also the suppliers gain power if they have a truly credible threat of forward integration. Of course, forward integration would mean that they not only are they a supplier, but they're going to get into my business. Now, when we were making key wound alarm clocks, we were making alarm clocks and timepieces. It turns out that most of our suppliers weren't interested in getting into that business. But there are other businesses where it's not much of a stretch for the supplier to get into the next phase of that business. For an example, this could be a company that makes pool chemicals and swimming pool supplies. Well, it would be very easy for them to get into the pool supply retail business rather than simply selling to retailers. They could actually sell to the end customer by having their own companies, their own stores. Another thing that creates a bargaining power for suppliers if the customer sees product differentiation. That is, if I know that your product is better than everybody else's product, and you know that I know that, then that person who supplies that product can charge more money. And examples of that might be, for instance, Caterpillar construction equipment and John Deere farming equipment might be two really good examples. There's also the issue of brand switching costs. That is, does it cost me money if I switch suppliers? In some cases, it might really impact my manufacturing and I might have to change my manufacturing process because I have different products, different quality levels of those things. And so we really want to identify brand switching costs. If I, as a buyer from a supplier, have no switching costs, then I gain power, and the supplier then, of course, loses power. And then finally, we have this issue of brand equity. And brand equity, when we talk about bargaining power of suppliers, really has to do with two factors: brand loyalty and perceived quality. Now, when we worked at Westclox, there were certain kinds of things that we only wanted to buy from one company because we really liked that product. And that could be things like, for instance, we would only buy Reed injection molding equipment. And we would only buy plastic molds from certain companies because we were loyal to that company. And one of the reasons that we tended to be loyal to those companies was that we thought that the products that they were selling had better quality than the other people. So this notion of brand equity influences power of suppliers. If a supplier has built up a lot of brand equity in its customers, then they gain power in that relationship. And then finally, we have this notion of potential new entrants. That is, the possibility of new producers coming into our business. This semester we're going to take a look at the mobile moving services business, where lots of different companies provide containers. It turns out that the barriers to entry in that business are relatively low, and there are lots of companies who could get into that business. Okay, so if the barriers of entry are low, then the likelihood of potential new entrants becomes high. All right, and is that good or bad? Well, of course, if lots of new businesses can come into our business, guess what happens to your profits? They go down. So barriers to entry include things like economy of scale. You're not likely to find new customers, new businesses coming into an industry if there isn't a benefit associated with economy of scale. Also, you will not see as many new entrants coming into a business in an industry if there is a learning curve. Now, you remember the notion of economy of scale. Remember the economy of scale argument from your economics class? Economy of scale means what? The more units you produce, the less it costs you per unit. And so there is an advantage of being bigger. That tends to be a deterrent for new entrants. The learning curve is the same thing, right? What's the notion of a learning curve? The more you produce, the better you get at producing them, and as a result, you move down the learning curve, and as you move down the learning curve, you get better and at least theoretically more effective and more efficient at creating your products. There's also a barrier to entry if people see large product differentiation. It's hard to get into a business, an industry, if there's already a lot of product differentiation in that business where customers all see everybody's products as different. Another thing that will prevent new entrants into a business would be switching costs. Of course, switching costs from a barrier to entry standpoint is what? Those are a deterrent for new businesses because many of the customers won't want to try your product because it will cost them a bunch of money to even try your product. And then another big barrier to entry in the marketing business is access to distribution channels. That is there a way to get my product in front of the customers? Now, when we were mostly a brick and mortar retail economy, distribution channels were harder to access by small companies. But in today's world, with a lot of online merchants, distribution is not as big of a challenge for many companies. Access to customers isn't the issue. It's building enough awareness so that customers actually recognize your brand name and are willing to at least consider it as an alternative. Another potential factor for potential new entrants is brand equity. The more that people believe that your brand is better than other brands and are loyal to that particular brand, the less likely it is for new entrants to be successful. So that creates another barrier to entry. If there are high capital requirements, the number of new entrants goes down because many people can't afford to enter that business. And then finally, there's the issue of government regulations. Of course, in Nevada, one of the major government regulations is you can't really open a casino unless you have a gaming license. And those gaming licenses are controlled by the Nevada Gaming Control Board. And as a result, not everybody is going to be into that business, which of course results in fewer potential new entrants into the gambling business as they go along. So there's potential new entrants. All four of those factors come together to influence the competitive rivalry within an industry. The less competitive rivalry there is in an industry, the more profits that are available. The more competitive rivalry within an industry, the less profits. So think about something like fast food restaurants. What do you think the competitive rivalry is among fast food restaurants? Well, it turns out that it's really high, right? And that's because there are lots of businesses, lots of different businesses that are in the fast food or quick serve restaurant business. And it turns out that and that's because of the four forces that we talked about being in such a way that it doesn't decrease the likelihood of new entrants, and it creates, as a result, more competitive rivalry. But in, of course, other industries, the competitive rivalry is reduced. Think about law firms, for an instance. There's a lot of rules regarding law firms and their ability to advertise. Well, if you can't advertise, and so people don't know about the alternatives, the competitive rivalry in an industry goes down, and and as a result, there are more profits to be had by everybody in an industry. Same thing happens in healthcare. All right, so competitive rivalry within an industry, some of the things that affect competitive rivalry is the number of competitors. As the number of competitors goes up, what happens to competitive rivalry? It also goes up. That's also true for, and in some cases, you don't need more competitors, but in other cases, if we keep having more and more new competitors come into an industry, the competitive rivalry goes up and the potential profits go down. The rate of industry growth impacts competitive rivalry, right? Because in an industry that has very low growth, the only way to gain share is to steal it from someone else. And as a result, if I have to get my customers from you, the competitive rivalry increases. So as industry growth increases, competitive rivalry decreases. Then we have industry capacity. So if there's a lot of unused capacity, competitive rivalry will increase, because if I have capacity that I'm not using, I want to do what? I want to use more of that capacity and become more effective and efficient, and have my fixed cost spread over more products. So if I have a lot of excess capacity, unused capacity, the competitive rivalry tends to go up. If there's a lot of competitive advantages in product differentiation, then competitive rivalry goes down. And the reason it goes down is because customers don't see you folks as viable alternatives for each other. Same thing happens with brand loyalty. If my customers are brand loyal, then I don't have as much competitive rivalry within my industry. But if my customers see 4 or 5 alternatives as viable alternatives, then the competitive rivalry increases. Think about the notion with Coke and Pepsi. Coke and Pepsi have a strong competitive rivalry because most customers see them as relative substitutes for each other. Not all people, but many people. On the other hand, they don't see Safeway Cola or Smith's Soda or Royal Crown Cola as, in fact, substitutes for each other. Okay, so and as a result, then the competitive rivalry goes down for all the competition except Pepsi and Coke, because Pepsi and Coke's customers see themselves as relatively similar. Brand loyalty, and then there's this issue of fixed and variable costs, which is an interesting notion. That is, as fixed costs go up, competitive rivalry goes up. And that's because companies have to be able to sell enough product to cover their fixed costs. As variable costs go up, the competitive rivalry, if there's a trade-off between fixed and variable costs don't have the same impact on those industries in terms of competitive rivalry. In summary, so what industries are best to be in? Well, it depends on your position, right? If you're already a player in an industry, you want an industry that has high potential profits. We used to refer to them as windfall profits. Well, which ones are those? Well, I really would like to be in an industry that has what? No pressure from substitutes, low power of buyers of my products, low power of suppliers of my products, high barriers to entry, so there are no threats of entry, and of course then that all results in low competitive rivalries, which in turn creates the potential for windfall profits.